think there were some fantastic questions and contributions, and Calvin, fantastic. Hard for me to follow that. But I will try and deal with some of the questions that came up. I mean, I won't deal with it adequately, because the whole question of slavery in the ancient world is a huge topic in itself. What I will say is this: of course, there certainly was. It would be wrong to say that slavery was first established at the advent of capitalism. There certainly was slavery in the ancient world, and those people who suffered under that, those people who were slaves must have suffered the most vicious and brutal exploitation and oppression, and were flogged to death. And who am I to stand here and say that what people experienced later than that was worse than what those people experienced? It was absolutely brutal, the exploitation and oppression that those people suffered. The distinction, the important point, the point that I want to make in this meeting, is that what you didn't have with slavery in ancient times was you didn't have the racism. And the kind of example that highlights this is that you had black slaves and white slaves, you had black emperors, you had black rulers and white rulers under ancient slavery. I mean, one of the most famous emperors in ancient times was a guy called Septimus Severus, I think is his name, who was unquestionably, he was black. So, the slavery and the divisions that you had in society at that time were not based upon race. And that is the thing that is so significant and so unique about slavery that we had at the advent of capitalism, precisely because it was at that time when those ideas that I mentioned about the freedom of all men being created equal in the eyes of God, precisely because that was happening at exactly the same time that tens of millions of people were being enslaved, they had to have something to justify it. There had to be an ideology that justified it, and that was where the racism that accompanied the slavery during the period that we're talking about came about. That was the critical legacy of slavery in those days. And actually, coming back to one of the other questions that was raised, it's right to say that it was becoming increasingly uneconomic. Because if you think about it, as industry, as technology becomes more sophisticated, you need a more stable workforce, educated, more fixed and settled labour force in order to work the more sophisticated machinery and so on. If you're simply relying upon people who will flog and flog and flog until their death, it becomes less economic, it becomes less efficient. And that was what was happening. That was why the struggle during the American Civil War was such a bitter struggle. So you were having a more advanced form of capitalism developing in the northern states that required a more stable, more settled, more educated workforce compared to what existed in the southern states, which was based literally upon flogging people to death in the field. That more advanced, more efficient system had to win out. And it is, simply relying upon people who you don't educate, you don't provide with, some level of subsistence, existence above subsistence. It becomes less economic, and that ultimately is what, let's be sure, let's be clear about this, the concessions that were given to people in terms of housing, in terms of food, in terms of education, wasn't given willingly by the capitalists. People had to fight and struggle for it. They would happily have flogged people to death if they could have got away with it. They couldn't get away with it because it was ultimately two things. Firstly, because people fought for freedom and better conditions, but also the capitalists became ultimately far-sighted enough to realise that it was in their interests as well to have a more stable and more settled workforce. So it's right to say that the increasingly uneconomic basis of slavery was one of the factors that led to it being got rid of. And actually, therefore, of course, one of the reasons why some of the capitalists, not because they cared about work, not because they cared about black people, but because they cared about increasing their profits, were prepared to make the concessions that ultimately helped to contribute to the end of slavery. I mean, and it's right to say, you know, I don't know whether I was soft on Wilberforce or not. I didn't say a great deal about Wilberforce precisely because I wanted to focus on, you know, the people on the ground who struggled and fought against slavery. What I would say is this. I mean, this little pamphlet, which was written by a great friend of mine, Hassan Mohammed, and some of the things that we talk about in Say It Loud are deliberately intended to tell the story of the ordinary people on the ground, black and white, who, you know, that hidden history that CLR talks about, people on the ground who organised and fought and struggled. That's why there's not much about Wilberforce in here. There's not much in Wilberforce in there. We talk about Olado Equiano. We talk about William Cuffin. We talk about Robert Wedderburn, you know, black working class people, ex-slaves and so on, who united with white working class individuals and organisations to fight against exploitation. And I would urge people to read this excellent little pamphlet that talks about those struggles on the ground. Sally's question. I don't think that the way that they, you know, it's certainly the case, it's absolutely the case, that the levels of incarceration in America and other countries is absolutely astronomical. You think about the fact that in America, literally 1/3 of adult men are somehow caught up in the criminal justice system. They're either in prison, on parole, waiting sentence, or on, you know, license of some sort. That is an astronomical level of criminalisation of people and incarceration. Shouldn't be complacent in this country. You know, I know from my experience as a lawyer, hugely disproportionate numbers of black and Asian young men particularly being dragged through the courts, being fitted up for crimes, being convicted, and every time getting much higher sentences than if they were white. But I don't think that that's the same as slavery. I mean, you look at, you know, for example, the cover, Bob Marley's album Survive. If you look at the cover of that album, it's got a picture of the slave ships, you know, that people were transported in, and you see people literally packed like sardines in these ships being transported, and this, you know, happened day after day after day for centuries. Tens of millions of people, as you say, you know, the people stolen from their civilizations, their cultures, their background. Tens of millions of people enslaved. And you know, this was, you know, industrial level transportation in order to work in the industries that were the pioneers of capitalism. That was, you know, something on an enormous scale to create the wealth that we see still today. That is something on a different scale to what you see in terms of people being incarcerated. Not to say, not in any way to play down, to play down the experience of those people who are trapped in the system, but rather than that being a different form of slavery, what I would argue is it is the legacy, is one of the critical legacies of slavery, because one of the critical legacy of slavery is racism. And although slavery, of course there are parts of the world where you hear of examples of slavery. I mean, that crazy example where people were imprisoned in this country, you know, convicted a few months ago in this country of enslaving people. You see on, you know, small scale like that, but not on the scale that it existed during the era of the slave trade. But it doesn't exist on the same level. But its legacy absolutely was racism. You know, the idea that people are different, inferior, not worthy, not entitled to the same resources as the rest of us because of a difference in their skin colour, or a difference in their culture, or a difference in their religion, or whatever, absolutely is the legacy of slavery. It's the legacy of that period of time. As I say, racism was born, as Eric Williams says in that book, racism was born of slavery. It's a consequence of slavery. That ideology grew out of slavery, which was used to justify the birth of capitalism. And although slavery doesn't exist on the same scale, in the same way as it did, racism absolutely does. Why? Because the ruling class realised that racism still was a key ideological tool that they could use to divide working people from each other. In a society where, you know, slavery might not exist, but absolutely exploitation and massive levels of inequality continue to exist, you know, on the same grand scale as they did before, and the ruling class has to somehow justify that. And the way that they justify that is by using means that any means at their disposal to divide working class people. And that's why the points that Kath made about this demonstration that is coming up and about the scapegoating that continues to exist is so fantastically important. I mean, the people who benefit from the legacy of racism, the people who continue to run these massive multinational corporations, who continue to be the bankers, who cream huge bonuses, who continue to run these major multinational corporations, who continue to run Parliament and so on. You see them in that poster, the people who went to Eton College, the friends and families of people like David Cameron, Boris Johnson, George Osborne, and so on. They're the people who continue to run our society. They're the people whose ancestors were the slavers. They're the people who run these major businesses today. I mean, what is George Osborne? A multi-millionaire. What is Cameron? A millionaire. Lives next door to Rebecca Brooks and so on. And they have, you know, no solution to the huge crises that continue to blight our societies. The massive banking crisis that we've seen over the last 5-6 years, which has laid waste to huge sections of, you know, the services that we rely on. You know, the fact that there's this meeting on the 26th talking about massive levels of cuts here in Leicester, what's that? That's a consequence of the economic crisis that has been created by the bosses and bankers. They have no solution to that crisis except to attack working class people. But they don't want us to turn around and blame them. They want us to turn around and blame each other, which is why they scapegoat, which is why they say it's because of the Romanians or because of the Bulgarians. Or what was it? You know, the immediate crisis that people are facing, the floods. What was it that Nigel Farage had to say about those last week? What was his intervention about the floods? That charity should begin at home. We shouldn't be spending all this money on foreign aid. We should be spending it on our people. So we should cut the budget of the Department for International Development, and then all the others, the Daily Mail, launching a petition which they were proud to announce had 100,000 people signing it, saying that it's wrong that the budget of the Department for International Development is protected, that we shouldn't be spending all this money on these foreigners, we should be spending it on our people. And let's say a few things about that budget. Firstly, you know, a few £billion is peanuts compared to what was stolen from the global south, from African countries over centuries, not just in economic terms, but as a comrade here says, in terms of the civilizations that were destroyed, the cultures and communities that were destroyed. You cannot put a price on what was taken from those people. It's that kind of scapegoating that they return to time and time and time again. So to answer my own question, I would say this. I do think that the call by people for reparations is an understandable one. And I absolutely think that those people who are responsible for the centuries of inequality and desperation and poverty that exists in so many parts of the world should be held to account. I live in East London. I live close to the grand factory of Tate and Lyle, the sugar company, who fat on the backs of millions of people who were slaves in the field. But you see those huge insurance companies that continue to exist, that continue to make massive profits. They should be held to account and should be made to pay for what they did to people over centuries. So I'm absolutely in favour of reparations in terms of taking the wealth that those people took from millions of people and giving it back to the families of those people. I want to say this as well, that it wasn't everyone who benefited in this country, everyone who benefited from slavery. It wasn't ordinary working class people here in Leicester or London, where I live, who benefited from slavery. It was the tiny minority, it was the elite who benefited. So I'm not in favour. If reparations means taking resources away from working class people, closing hospitals, schools, social services and so on, in order to pay reparations to foreign countries, I'm not in favour of that. What I'm in favour of is, if you like the sentiment that Calvin expressed in his song, "We are in it together." We, working class people, black and white, are in it together. We are all victims of a society that exploits working class people, that uses all means of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, to try and divide our side, to make people think that our enemies are white people, Asian people, black people, or whatever, not seeing that the people who are responsible for all of the misery, all of the exploitation in the world, is a tiny minority, a tiny elite across the globe. And in some of the countries, African countries, there is a black elite who have grown fat and wealthy on the backs of other black people. That's why, I'll finish by saying this, that's why the demonstration that Kath mentioned on the 22nd of March is so important, because we should be in no doubt. We are in a period running up to the European elections in May of this year and the general election in May of next year, at which scapegoating is going to get worse. I mean, barely a day goes by, does it, when you don't hear some rotten, rancid story from the Tories, from UKIP, and it has to be said to their shame, from the Labour Party, about foreigners, about migrants, about Romania. The Labour Party spent almost its entire life apologising for the immigration policies under the last Labour government, as if immigration was responsible for the inequality, the poverty that people are experiencing. We should say loud and clear that it isn't foreigners who are responsible for the destruction of our health service, our education system, our public services. It is the bosses and the bankers, the very same people who grew fat and wealthy on the backs of slaves over the centuries. That the demonstration is about saying we are going to stand up to that against that kind of scapegoating. And I think that's why putting a marker in the sand, getting as many people as possible from here in Leicester down to that demonstration on the 22nd of March is so fantastically important. And it's about not only leave a bit of a legacy in terms of saying that we're not going to allow that kind of scapegoating, but it lays the basis for the kind of unity, black and white unity, which ultimately I think, we see the examples. It was that kind of unity that would play a central role in overthrowing slavery centuries ago. It's that kind of unity that can and must play a role in getting rid of the exploitative and the oppressive system that we live under. That is what the organisation that I'm part of, that organised this meeting, the Socialist Workers Party, argues for. We argue for black and white working class unity, that we are all in it together, the overwhelming majority of ordinary people in society against a tiny minority elite own and control all of the wealth in society. We create that wealth and they steal it from us. We have to organise ourselves to reclaim that. And that's why I'm part of an organisation, the SWP, that tries to involve itself in every single struggle, every single campaign that can bring black and white people together in those kinds of struggles. And I would urge anybody who's not a member, who've enjoyed what we've had to say, and welcome and agree with what we have to say, come and join us, because we need each other more than ever before.